Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The wind carried fine dust through the valley as daylight bled out over the flatland. The Grady Ranch stood quiet, a long single-story house with warped siding, its paint baked away years ago by the desert sun. Inside, Elias Grady sat by the table near the oil lamp, shoulders slightly hunched, working a piece of rawhide into a halter. The room smelled of horse sweat, tobacco, and kerosene. Outside, a loose shutter tapped against the wall. Steady as a clock, he had stopped winding since his wife died. Elias was 43. Once known in Las Piedras as the man who broke wild Mustangs faster than anyone, he had not set foot in town for weeks. 5 years earlier, he'd buried his wife, Martha, behind the cottonwoods near the creek. A fever had taken her in less than 3 days. Since then, he had lived with only his dog, Ranger, and the slow rhythm of ranch work that gave him no comfort but kept him alive. Every evening ended the same way. One chair, one lamp, one ring hanging from a leather string around his neck. He had stopped expecting any knock at the door years ago. That's why when one came, soft, almost afraid, it sent a cold shot through him. He froze, the leather strap dangling from his hand. Ranger's ears twitched before a low growl broke the silence. The second knock came, barely audible against the wind. Elias stood, set down the halter, and reached for the rifle propped beside the wall. Old habits came back easy. The desert didn't forgive carelessness. He walked to the door, boots creaking against the floorboards. The lamplight threw his shadow across the wall as he eased the latch open. Rain hit his face in a fine mist. A woman stood on the porch, soaked, hair plastered to her forehead. A small canvas bag clutched her chest. He knew that face before she spoke. The eyes, the curve of her mouth. Not the same, but close enough to shake him. Clara, Martha's younger sister. She swallowed, her breath quick and uneven. Elias, she said, voice trembling from cold, not nerves. I didn't know where else to go. He didn't answer right away. His mind worked fast but silent. Clara had married young, to a farmer named Jacob Dunn, 2 towns east. He remembered shaking the man's hand at their wedding, thinking he looked like trouble that wore a smile. Elias hadn't seen her since Martha's funeral. Now she stood before him, alone in the rain. He studied her, her dress torn at one sleeve, shoes caked in mud. She looked like she hadn't eaten properly in days. What happened? His tone was low, cautious. She hesitated. Jacob's gone. Lost everything. The farm. The stock. Then he left. I waited a month. Couldn't stay any longer. She took a small step forward, her voice thinning. You're the only family I have left. Elias's chest tightened. Behind his calm eyes, memories moved like embers. Martha laughing in this same doorway, brushing dust off her skirt, setting a plate in front of him. He could still hear her voice in the way Clara spoke, softer but similar. He gripped the doorframe, the wood rough beneath his hand. Letting Clara in meant opening the door to everything he had spent 5 years trying to bury. But turning her away was something Martha would never have forgiven. He exhaled through his nose, stepped aside, and said, "Come in." Clara hesitated once more, the way someone does before stepping onto thin ice, then crossed the threshold. The warmth of the room hit her. She shivered harder from the contrast. Elias shut the door and set the rifle back down. He motioned toward the stove. "Sit there," he said. "You're soaked." She nodded and sat, rubbing her hands near the faint orange glow from the coals. Her fingers were red from cold, nails chipped. Elias poured what water was left in the kettle, added a spoon of coffee grounds, and set it to boil. The sound filled the silence between them. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she looked around the room, her gaze pausing at the framed photo of Martha on the shelf. She didn't say anything. The fire popped. For a moment, she looked small, like someone who had walked too far and forgotten what home was supposed to feel like. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into a tin cup and slid it across the table. "Ain't got sugar," he muttered. She wrapped her hands around the cup, inhaled the steam, and whispered, "It's fine." She sipped slowly, her shoulders easing as the warmth spread through her. Elias leaned against the counter, arms crossed. His thoughts were steady but heavy. He didn't know how long she planned to stay. He didn't know if he wanted to ask. He felt something close to fear, not of her, but of what her presence might stir up. The ranch had become a place where nothing changed. He had made peace with silence, with dust, with the sound of his own boots echoing off empty walls. Now, standing in that same house, he felt the air shift, alive again, and he wasn't sure if that was comfort or danger. After a long minute, he spoke. "You can take the spare room. It used to be Martha's sewing room." His voice was even, but the name caught slightly in his throat. "It's clean enough." "Thank you," Clara said softly. "I'll earn my keep. I can cook, mend things." He stopped her with a small shake of his head. "You just rest tonight. We'll talk in the morning." She nodded and looked down, eyes glassy with exhaustion. He fetched a towel and set it beside her, then turned to stoke the fire. The clock on the wall ticked, faint but steady. When Elias finally sat again, the lamplight flickered across his face. He glanced toward her. She had dozed off in the chair, chin resting on her shoulder, cup still in her hands. He thought of waking her, but didn't. He simply watched her breathe for a few seconds, then looked at the ring hanging from his neck. He closed his hand around it, feeling its cold edge press into his palm. For the first time in 5 years, Elias Grady felt unsure of what tomorrow might bring. But he knew one thing. He couldn't send her back into that rain. He set the ring beside the lamp and whispered under his breath, "Rest easy, Martha. I'm just doing what you'd have wanted." The wind eased outside, and the house, long silent, seemed to breathe again. Dawn spread pale light across the mesa, the kind that made every shape stand out in harsh, honest color. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the earth dark and heavy with moisture. Elias rose early, as he always did, and pulled on his boots. The air smelled of wet dust and wood smoke. He stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, watching the steam rise from the coffee pot, listening to the slow creak of the windmill turning in the distance. For 5 years, mornings had followed the same rhythm. Wake, feed the horses, mend what was broken, eat alone. But that morning, the sound of quiet movement came from the back room. Clara. He'd almost convinced himself she might have left before sunrise. He wouldn't have blamed her. The house was rough, the air cold, the land unforgiving. But when she stepped into the kitchen, still wearing the same dress from the night before, hair loose and damp at the ends, he realized she wasn't going anywhere. Her face looked softer in daylight, though her eyes carried the kind of tiredness that didn't go away with sleep. "Morning," Elias said, voice low but steady. "Morning," she answered. Her tone was polite, almost careful. She looked around, her gaze stopping at the stack of tools near the door and the patched walls. "You've kept it just like Martha had it." Elias's hands froze around the coffee pot. The sound of her name spoken aloud, even gently, cut through him like a dull knife. He set the pot down and nodded once. Didn't see much reason to change it. She hesitated. "It feels the same, except quieter." He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. He handed her a tin cup. "Coffee strong. There's bread if you're hungry." She took the cup and sipped carefully. Her stomach turned at first, the bitter taste, the raw edge of hunger fighting the warmth. But she forced herself to swallow. "Thank you," she said softly. "I can cook something later, if you'd like." He shrugged, eyes still on the table. "If you feel up to it." As she drank, her eyes wandered to the framed photo of Martha on the shelf above the stove. A young woman smiling faintly, wind pushing strands of hair across her face. Clara stared at it longer than she meant to. She saw the same ring on her sister's hand that now rested in a drawer somewhere, she guessed. The sight pulled something deep in her chest. Not jealousy, not grief exactly, but the strange ache of living in the shadow of someone who had always seemed stronger, steadier, more loved. Elias noticed her looking, but said nothing. Inside, his thoughts churned. Martha had died in that very room, wrapped in blankets while he sat helpless with cold cloths and prayers that went unanswered. Letting Clara stay meant waking those memories. Still, he could not ask her to leave. Not when she looked half-starved and half-scared of the world outside his door. By mid-morning, Clara found her rhythm. cleaning dishes that hadn't been used in years, sweeping corners filled with fine dust, shaking out blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. Elias worked outside, repairing a fence post splintered by the storm. Each time he came back for tools, he saw her moving through the house with quiet purpose. It unsettled him, seeing life return to the rooms that had forgotten what it looked like. At noon, they ate together, simple bread, dried meat, and coffee. Conversation stayed shallow. Elias asked where she had been these last months, and Clara, after a pause, told him. Jacob lost everything. He started drinking, blaming me for it. One morning, he was gone. I waited a while, but folks stopped coming by. Then I sold what little was left and took the road. Her eyes stayed fixed on her plate. Didn't think I'd make it this far. Elias leaned back, jaw tightening. You walked. Mostly. A wagon took me halfway, then broke an axle. I came to rest alone. He rubbed his forehead. It's near 50 miles of open country. You're lucky to still be standing. She gave a faint, weary smile. Luck had nothing to do with it. I just kept walking. He studied her quietly. There was grit beneath the soft tone, something familiar, the kind that only hardship built. He found himself respecting her for it, though part of him still fought the idea of her being there at all. After lunch, Elias saddled the bay mare and rode to the creek to check the water level. Clara watched him from the porch, arms wrapped around herself, the hem of her dress moving in the breeze. He rode with a steady posture, every motion practiced, a man built from repetition, carrying both dignity and weight in the way he moved. She wondered how he had survived alone all these years. What he thought about at night when the wind rose. By late afternoon, he returned to find the table set, beans simmering in a pot, cornbread cooling beside it. The sight caught him off guard. It had been years since anyone cooked in that kitchen. He removed his hat, brushed dust from his coat, and hesitated before sitting down. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she replied simply. But I wanted to. They ate in near silence, but the air felt different. Not lighter, not warmer, but alive again. When they finished, Clara started to clear the plates, and Elias stopped her with a quiet word. Leave it. I'll handle it later. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Not affection, not yet, but recognition. Two people who had both been abandoned in different ways and were still trying to learn how to stand without shaking. That night, after she retired to the small room down the hall, Elias sat alone by the fire. He turned the ring over in his palm, staring at the worn engraving inside. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt uneasy, uncertain, but alive. He thought about Clara's hands red from washing, her voice low and steady when she spoke of being left behind. He understood that kind of pain. It was the same that had kept him from riding into town, from starting over, from anything that meant moving on. As he doused the lamp, he looked toward the closed door of the spare room. He told himself he'd give her a few days, just until she found her footing. Then she could decide where to go next. But deep down, Elias knew what he wouldn't yet admit. The moment he opened that door to her, he'd already made the decision. Morning came with a hard blue sky and the sound of a hammer echoing against wood. Elias was already outside by the corral, setting a new post where the fence had collapsed during the last rain. Sweat ran down his temples, the sun not yet high, but the work steady and demanding. He didn't look toward the house much, but every now and then his eyes flicked to the open doorway where Clara moved in and out with quiet rhythm. She was sweeping the porch, shaking out rugs that hadn't seen daylight in years. The sight of her, there was something he still hadn't gotten used to. 4 or 5 years that porch had been nothing but dust, the boards gray and untouched. Now there were fresh curtains in the window and the faint smell of soap drifting out. Inside, Clara was finding her own sense of purpose. She'd spent the night before sewing a tear in her dress with Martha's old thread kit, a small tin box she'd found in a drawer. Touching those spools and needles had made her chest tighten, but she used them anyway. The house, though humble, had a sturdy kind of warmth buried beneath neglect. Each small thing she did, cleaning, washing, fixing, brought it back piece by piece. She wasn't doing it out of duty. She was doing it because it gave her something to hold on to. By mid-morning, she stepped outside carrying a small basin of water to rinse linens. Elias paused from his work when he saw her struggling to drag the heavy basin off the steps. Without speaking, he set down his hammer and crossed the yard. "Here," he said, taking it from her hands. His voice was calm, even, but his eyes softened a little. "Thank you," she replied, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. He nodded and poured the water where she had meant to, then stepped back to give her space. For a moment, they stood there, the silence stretched between the windmill's creak and the cry of a hawk overhead. Then Clara said, "You work like the world depends on it." Elias gave a short, tired smile. "Out here, it sometimes does." Her gaze drifted to the horses grazing beyond the fence. "You keep them all by yourself?" "Been doing it since Martha passed," he said simply. Didn't see the sense in hiring help. Cheaper to wear myself out than feed another man. Clara studied him, not with pity but understanding. His face was lined, not from age alone, but from the years of silence and sun. She could see how loneliness had shaped him, not broken him, but carved him into something harder, quieter. "You must have loved her deeply," she said softly. Elias's hands froze at the fence wire. He didn't look up. "I did," he said. "Still do, I guess. But love don't keep the work done." He straightened the post and tightened the wire, eyes on his task, voice steady again. "Martha liked this land. Said it felt honest, like it didn't promise more than it could give. I stayed because of that, and because I didn't know what else to do." Clara nodded, the weight of his words settling between them. She didn't speak for a while. When she finally did, it was quieter. She was lucky, she said, to have someone stay. Elias looked up then, his eyes meeting hers for a second too long. Something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a quiet recognition that both of them knew what it meant to lose something you weren't ready to let go of. He cleared his throat and returned to his work, pretending to focus on the wire. As the day went on, Clara took on more tasks. She baked cornbread using flour she found in the pantry, boiled beans, and even patched one of Elias's shirts that had split at the shoulder. When he came inside that evening, the smell of warm bread filled the air. For a man who had eaten cold biscuits and jerky for years, it felt almost strange to sit at a table again. Clara set down 2 plates and poured water from a clay jug. She spoke without looking at him. "I found Martha's sewing things. I used them to fix your shirt. I hope that's all right." Elias paused, knife in hand. "They're yours to use," he said after a moment. She'd rather see them doing something useful than sitting in a drawer. That answer seemed to settle something in her. She gave a small nod and began to eat. For a while, the only sounds were the quiet scrape of cutlery and the ticking clock. Then Clara asked, "Do you ever go into town?" Elias looked up. "Not much reason to. Supplies come once a month if I plan right. I keep to myself. Do people ask about you?" He smirked faintly. "Not likely. Folks out here forget easy. A man disappears. They figure the desert took him or he wanted to be gone." Clara hesitated before saying, "I don't think you ever wanted to disappear." That line landed harder than she knew. Elias's expression didn't change, but his grip on the fork did. He looked down at his plate and said quietly, "Maybe not. But sometimes it's easier than facing what's left." The rest of the meal passed in silence. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding rather than distance. Later, when night settled in, Clara walked to the porch and sat under the dim glow of the lamp. The air smelled of sage and rain-soaked earth. She looked out across the empty land and tried to imagine what her life might look like if she stayed. She had no husband, no home beyond these dry hills, and no plan. But here, for the first time in months, she didn't feel hunted by her own thoughts. Inside, Elias watched her from the doorway. She looked steady, stronger than when she had arrived. He felt a flicker of something close to relief. Still, his mind turned over the same question that had been growing since the night she knocked. How long would she stay? And what would it mean if she didn't leave? When Clara finally stood and turned in for the night, Elias went to the mantel and stared at the wedding ring that sat beside the lamp. He picked it up, turned it once between his fingers, then set it back down with care. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was beginning to breathe again, quietly, cautiously, but unmistakably alive. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both Elias and Clara knew that something had shifted. The grief that had once filled every corner of that ranch now had to share its space with the faint, steady return of life itself. The wind shifted again that week, rolling down from the mountains cold and dry. By late afternoon, the air carried a bite that hinted at winter. Elias had spent the day hauling firewood from the north slope, his shirt damp with sweat despite the chill. As he rode back into the yard, the sky was dimming, the color of pewter. Clara was on the porch, hanging a blanket she'd just finished mending. She waved, a quiet, natural motion, as if she'd been doing it for years. He nodded back. It struck him how normal that gesture felt, and how strange it was to realize that. Inside, the house was warmer than usual. The stove crackled, the scent of stew hanging thick in the air. Clara had filled the space with small changes. Fresh curtains, cleaned lantern glass, and a few of Martha's old jars lined neatly along the shelf. Elias noticed them all without comment. He sat at the table, unlaced his boots, and poured himself water. Clara ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them down. "You've been out since dawn," she said. "What had to come in before the freeze," he replied. "If the storm hits early, we'll be burning scrap before long." She nodded. "I can help stack it tomorrow." He gave a faint, almost amused look. "You ever stacked wood before?" "No," she admitted. "But I can learn." That made him smile just barely. "Then we'll see what kind of worker you are." They ate quietly. The rhythm between them had grown steady. Not comfortable yet, but familiar. She asked questions about the ranch, how many horses he had, what he grew before the drought, how far it was to town. He answered simply, sometimes adding a short story when the memory seemed worth keeping alive. She learned that the dog, Ranger, had belonged to Martha first, that the well behind the barn went down 30 feet and never once ran dry, and that Elias hadn't left the ranch for more than a day in 5 years. After dinner, she washed dishes while he checked the window latches. The wind had picked up, rattling loose boards. As he tested one by the back room, he noticed the frame shudder slightly with every gust. "This one's bad," he muttered. "Needs fixing before the night's through." "I can help," Clara said, already moving toward him. He turned, caught off guard by how quick she was to offer. "It's fine. Just stay by the stove." "I'm not helpless, Elias." He stopped, seeing the firmness in her eyes. Not defiance, but resolve. He handed her a lantern and nodded once. "Hold it steady, then." They worked side by side as the wind roared against the outer wall. She held the light while he replaced nails, pressing new boards into the frame. The lantern's glow cast their shadows long across the wall. At one point, the light flickered, and she raised her hand to shield it. Her fingers brushed his wrist, quick, accidental, but enough to send a current through both of them. Elias didn't move for a moment. Then he cleared his throat, drove another nail, and said quietly, "That should hold for tonight." Clara exhaled softly, her voice steady. "You've lived with this kind of weather for years?" He nodded. "You learn to respect it. It don't care who you are." Same with the land. She looked around the room. The patched walls, the worn tools, the rough life he had built here. "And you stayed," she said, almost to herself. He didn't answer. Instead, he lit another lantern and carried it to the table. The house felt more alive than it ever had, the kind of alive that made him uneasy. He was used to silence, not conversation, not the sound of another person breathing in the same room. Yet now, he didn't want to quiet back. That night, the wind turned violent. The boards creaked, and the air whistled through the cracks. Sometime after midnight, a sharp crack echoed through the house, the sound of breaking glass. Elias was out of bed before he was fully awake, rifle in hand, boots half on. He followed the sound to the back hallway. One of the windows had blown in, shards glittering on the floor. The curtains whipped inward like torn sails. Cold air cut through the house. He moved fast, grabbing a blanket to block the draft. "Damn it," he muttered. Clara's voice came from behind him, shaky but alert. "What happened?" "Back window broke." "Stay back. There's glass everywhere." But she stepped closer anyway, holding a candle that trembled in her hand. The flame threw light over her face, pale, alert, afraid but trying not to show it. Elias found himself noticing that courage before anything else. He swept the shards aside with his boot, nailed a plank roughly across the opening, and finally turned to her. "You should go back to bed," he said. "I can't sleep," she admitted. "The wind sounds like it's tearing the walls apart." "It'll pass," he told her, though even he wasn't sure when. They stood there, both half-dressed, the air freezing around them. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Clara spoke softly. "I'll sleep in the front room. It's warmer there." He hesitated, weighing the words. "The fire won't last all night. I'll add wood before I turn in." She gave a small nod and walked away. But an hour later, when Elias went to check the stove, he found the couch empty. He frowned, turned toward the hallway, and saw a faint shape in his own bedroom doorway. Clara was sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed, wrapped in her blanket. "The wind comes through the floorboards in the other room," she said quietly. "I didn't want to bother you. I'll just stay on the edge until it passes." Elias stood still, the words caught in his throat. For a second, all he could see was Martha, her sister's outline, the same hair, the same quiet voice in the same room. But the person sitting there wasn't Martha. It was someone hurt, cold, and trying not to be a burden. He finally nodded. "All right, stay as long as you need." He sat at the table in the corner, poured himself coffee, and watched the storm through the cracks in the boards. Clara pulled the blanket tighter and lay back carefully, eyes half closed. The room filled with the soft sounds of wind and breathing. Elias felt the old ache in his chest twist, grief mixing with something he didn't have a name for yet. He wasn't drawn to her out of desire. It was something deeper, quieter. The simple realization that another living soul was under his roof again, trusting him with her safety, was almost unbearable in its weight. By dawn, the wind had died. He poured a second cup of coffee and carried it to her. When she opened her eyes, he said nothing, just handed it over. She accepted it with both hands, her voice rough from sleep. "Thank you." He nodded once, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. Neither spoke. The sun pushed through the cracks in the boarded window, painting narrow lines of light across the floor. For the first time since his wife's death, Elias Grady didn't feel alone in his own home. And though he would never say it aloud, he knew something had changed between them that night. Something small but real, like the first warmth after a long winter. The morning after the storm was still and gray. The ground outside steamed faintly under the first light, and puddles shone like dull mirrors across the yard. Elias stepped out with his coffee in hand, the taste strong and bitter. The quiet after the night's chaos felt strange, almost hollow. The wind had left behind broken branches, a torn shutter, and a new silence that pressed against his chest. When he turned back toward the doorway, Clara was there, her hair tied loosely, her dress wrinkled from sleep, holding her own cup with both hands. She looked at him for a moment before saying, "We didn't sleep." He nodded once, didn't want the fire dying out. The words carried no emotion, but she heard what was behind them, that he'd stayed awake to make sure the house held, to make sure she was safe. She didn't mention it. Instead, she walked down the steps, the boards creaking under her feet, and began gathering the pieces of glass scattered by the storm. "You don't have to do that," Elias said. "I want to," she replied quietly. "This house kept me warm last night. I can at least make it clean again." He didn't argue. Instead, he joined her, picking up the larger shards, their fingers brushing once when they reached for the same piece. Neither pulled away. It wasn't deliberate, but the pause that followed held something neither of them could name. When the work was done, Clara patched a cloth across the window and set the broom aside. She stood by the table, watching Elias pour water into the kettle. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. "You said once you don't go into town much, but you'll need glass for the window." He kept his eyes on the flame. "I'll ride in tomorrow. It's a day's ride each way if the trail's dry. Then I'll pack food for you," she said. He looked up at her, uncertain why the offer felt like more than it was. "You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I will." Elias nodded, ending the moment before it deepened further. He needed the quiet work outside to clear his thoughts. That night had shifted something he couldn't easily set back into place. Seeing Clara in his bed, even clothed, even innocent, had opened a space in him he'd boarded shut for years. A man could live half dead for a long time, but once reminded of what warmth felt like, there was no pretending he didn't notice the cold anymore. By late afternoon, they had fallen into a strange rhythm again. Clara cooked, humming softly under her breath, and Elias fixed the stable door that had come loose. When evening came, she lit the lamp early. The flame caught in her eyes as she set 2 plates on the table. During supper, she asked, "Elias, can I ask you something personal?" He hesitated. "Depends what it is. When Martha died, did you ever think about leaving this place?" He set his fork down, his jaw tightening. "Every day for a year. Then one morning I woke up, and the thought of leaving felt worse than staying. Because of her, because of me," he said after a pause. "I buried her here. Leaving would have meant burying myself too." Clara didn't speak. She understood what he meant, that some griefs weren't about holding on to love, but about surviving the weight of it. After a long silence, she said quietly, "You're stronger than you think." He almost smiled, the expression faint, fleeting, or just too stubborn to quit. Later that night, as Elias prepared his gear for the ride to town, Clara lingered by the window. "Do you need anything else while you're there?" she asked. "Salt, wire, glass," he said, ticking them off in his head. Then, after a brief pause, "Do you want me to send a letter for you?" Her fingers froze around the curtain's edge. She looked at him, startled by the question. "A letter? To anyone who might be looking for you," he said. His tone was careful, not prying. Clara's eyes darkened. "There's no one left to write to." She turned back to the window, her voice quieter. "Jacob's gone. My father's been dead for years. The rest wouldn't care even if they heard." Elias didn't push further. "All right," he said simply. She nodded, grateful he didn't dig at old wounds. "Then just come back safe." He studied her for a moment, the steadiness in her voice, the faint tremor in her hands. "I always do," he said, but it wasn't entirely true. A man didn't live that long in solitude without losing parts of himself on the way. The next morning, the trail to Las Piedras stretched wide and empty. Elias rode hard through the dry wind, reaching town by mid-afternoon. He didn't like towns much anymore. The stairs, the noise, the talk. He bought glass, salt, wire, and coffee, all while keeping to himself. But as he was tying the supplies to his saddle, a voice called from behind. "Elias Grady." He turned. A tall, lean man stood near the saloon steps. Rough beard, bloodshot eyes, a half-empty bottle dangling from one hand. Elias knew that face. "Jacob Dunn, Clara's husband. Didn't expect to see you this far from your grave," Jacob said with a bitter grin. Elias didn't rise to it. "You're drunk." Jacob laughed. "You've got my wife, haven't you?" His voice carried across the street. A few men turned to look. "You think I don't know? She ran off crying about me, and now she's warming your bed." Elias stepped closer, his tone still low but edged with iron. "You abandoned her. You left her with nothing." "She's mine," Jacob snarled. "You can't change that with your damn silence and your pity." Elias's jaw flexed. "She's her own woman. You made sure of that when you walked away." Jacob's grin faltered for a moment before the anger returned. "You don't scare me, Grady." "I don't have to," Elias said, and with that he turned his back. He left town without looking behind him, the sound of Jacob's voice fading into the wind. By the time Elias returned to the ranch the next evening, dusk had settled. Clara met him by the gate, relief flooding her face when she saw him. "You're back," she said, exhaling the words like she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath all day. "Didn't plan on doing otherwise," he answered. He unloaded the supplies, but Clara could tell something in his posture had changed, a new heaviness, a tension in his shoulders. She asked quietly, "Did something happen?" He hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "I saw him." Clara froze. "Jacob?" Elias nodded. "He's in town. He knows where you are." She went pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Did he say?" "He said enough," Elias interrupted. "But I told him you weren't his concern anymore." Clara's eyes filled with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't peace either. "He won't come here," she said, as if trying to convince herself. Elias met her gaze steadily. "If he does, he'll leave worse than he came. They stood in silence for a long time after that. The oil lamp hissed softly between them, and the air grew heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Outside, the night stretched wide and cold, the stars sharp above the dark hills. Inside, the house stood firm, two people under one roof, both haunted by what they'd lost, but no longer entirely alone. And for the first time, Clara realized something she hadn't dared to hope since the day she knocked on that door. That maybe in this quiet, worn-out place, she had finally found the kind of safety she'd been searching for all her life. The following days passed under a tense calm that neither Elias nor Clara dared to disturb. The ranch carried on as it always did, fences to mend, animals to feed, meals to share, but beneath the simple rhythm, something had shifted. Both of them knew Jacob Dunn was out there somewhere, and the thought of him hung over the quiet like a storm that refused to break. Elias checked the perimeter more often now. He made sure the rifle stayed cleaned, oiled, and within reach. He didn't say why, but Clara knew. She noticed the way he glanced toward the horizon each time he stepped outside, or how Ranger's ears would perk up when Elias stopped mid-task to listen to some distant sound only he could hear. Inside, Clara moved carefully through the rooms. She kept herself busy, baking, mending, scrubbing, anything to keep her mind steady. But the image of Jacob, the man who had once been her husband, kept rising uninvited. She remembered his temper, the way it had turned from charm to cruelty in small, measured steps, the way his drinking had turned every evening into something she had to survive rather than share. When Elias told her Jacob had seen him in town, her first instinct had been fear. But now, after days of thought, that fear had hardened into something colder, resolve. She wasn't going back. Not again. One afternoon, while Elias was hauling hay from the barn, she stepped outside with a pot of water and said, "If he comes, I want to face him myself." Elias turned, resting an arm on the fence rail. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "He won't get the chance to come this far." Clara shook her head. "You can't fight all my ghosts for me." He didn't answer right away. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry sage. Finally, he said, "If you want to face him, you'll have the chance. But not alone." That night, Elias sat at the table sharpening his knife. The sound was slow, deliberate, steel against stone, a rhythm he'd fallen into countless times. Clara watched him from across the room, folding cloths near the stove. The lamplight caught the side of his face, showing the lines that years of loss and solitude had carved into him. "You've lived like this for 5 years," she said quietly, "always waiting for something to go wrong." He gave a small, dry laugh. "When you've buried one person you love, you start thinking the world's got a taste for taking what's left." Clara paused her folding. Maybe the world's not taking anymore. Maybe it's giving something back. Elias stopped sharpening, the knife still in his hand, and met her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them looked away. Then he set the knife down. "You ought to get some rest," he said softly. The next morning, the sound of hooves broke the fragile peace. Elias was outside fixing the gate when he heard it. One rider coming from the south road. Ranger barked once, low and alert. Elias's hand went to the rifle leaning against the fence post. Clara stepped onto the porch. Her face drained of color when she saw the man approaching. Jacob Dunn rode with a bottle tied to his saddle, his clothes dirty, his hat tilted low. Even from a distance, his sway in the saddle told the story. Drunk again. Elias's shoulders straightened. He didn't move toward the gun yet. He just waited. Jacob stopped at the edge of the yard and called out, voice rough and slurred, "Clara, you coming home?" Clara's hand tightened around the porch rail, but she didn't step back. "This is my home now," she said, steady but quiet. Jacob's laugh was loud and bitter. "Your home? With him? The man who took pity on you?" Elias stepped forward, his tone even. "You've had your say. Now you can turn around." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "You don't tell me what to do, Grady. She's my wife." Clara's voice broke through before Elias could reply. "Not anymore, Jacob." She walked down 2 steps, her hands trembling but her voice gaining strength. "You left me. You lost the farm, the animals, and your temper. You sold everything we had for whiskey and blame. I buried enough of my life beside you. I won't bury what's left. Jacob stared at her, something ugly twisting in his expression. You think you're better than me now? Wearing her clothes, cooking in her kitchen? His eyes flicked toward Elias. You think she's anything but your wife's shadow? The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, Elias's restraint cracked. He stepped closer, his voice low and cold. You'd best leave before you forget you're still breathing. Jacob grinned, a hollow, mean grin. You gonna shoot me, Grady? In front of her? That what a good man does. Elias didn't move, didn't raise the rifle. He simply said no. But if you take one more step, I'll stop being a good man. The silence that followed was sharp enough to hurt. The only sound was the creak of Jacob's saddle leather and the restless snort of his horse. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Jacob spat on the ground, turned his horse sharply, and rode off without another word. Clara stood frozen on the steps until the sound of hooves faded completely. Her breath came hard and uneven. Elias lowered the rifle and walked toward her. He's gone, he said. She nodded, eyes glassy. He'll be back. Maybe, Elias said, but not the same way. Inside, Clara sat at the table, hands clasped tight together. Elias poured her water, and she drank it in silence. When she finally looked up, there was no fear left in her eyes, only exhaustion and relief. Thank you, she whispered. Elias shook his head. You don't owe me thanks. You faced him yourself. She gave a faint, tired smile. Not alone. That night, the ranch was quiet again. The stars hung low, bright and cold. Elias stood by the door long after she had gone to bed, watching the dark horizon. He thought about how easily a man's peace could be disturbed, how something you'd spent years guarding could be threatened by a single knock, a single name from your past. Yet as he looked back toward the room where Clara now slept, he knew this time felt different. The ghosts that had ruled that house for years were starting to lose their hold. The loneliness that once weighed like a stone had begun to lift, replaced by something fragile but alive. Trust, maybe, or something close to it. Elias knew trouble might come again, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to run from it. Not while someone else was willing to stand beside him. Outside, Ranger lay by the porch, head on his paws, the night breeze rustling through the dry grass. The ranch, scarred but standing, had finally found its breath again. And inside, two people, both once broken in different ways, were learning what it meant to build something steady from the wreckage of their pasts. 2 weeks passed after Jacob's visit, and not a single rider had been seen on the horizon since. The air had shifted around the ranch, still cautious, still quiet, but no longer heavy with fear. Elias and Clara moved through the days with a steadiness that came only from hard work and unspoken trust. The rhythm they had built, him in the fields, her tending the home, settled into something natural, something that no longer felt borrowed or temporary. Still, at night, when the wind pressed against the windows or a horse snorted too sharply in the dark, Clara would startle awake. Each time, Elias would hear the faint creak of the floorboards as she checked the latch on her door. He never spoke of it. He understood that kind of restlessness, the kind born from years of having to look over your shoulder. One morning, she found him by the stable, mending a saddle strap. He looked up when she approached, the early sun hitting the side of his weathered face. She carried a small basket with bread and apples, and for once, she was smiling. You work before you eat, she said. He smirked faintly. If I eat first, I'll never finish the work. She set the basket down beside him and crouched to his level. You ever stop working, Elias? He thought about it before answering. Didn't have much reason to. You do now, she said quietly, the words almost lost to the sound of wind through the barn door. Elias looked at her, really looked, and for a moment he didn't see Martha's ghost in her face anymore. He saw Clara as she was, bruised by her past, yes, but alive, strong, and steady. Something loosened inside him. For 5 years, his life had been one long act of remembering. Now, without trying, he found himself wanting to look forward. Later that day, they rode together to the south pasture. It was the first time Clara had been on a horse since arriving. Her grip was awkward at first, her shoulders stiff, but she was determined. Elias watched her struggle, hiding his smile. "You don't have to lean that much," he said, riding close beside her. "You let the horse do the work." "I know," she said, tightening her reins. "I just don't want to fall." "You won't," he said simply. "I've got you." The words hung between them, heavier than they sounded. Clara's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time, she believed him completely. By afternoon, the clouds gathered thick and gray. A soft drizzle turned the dirt dark, and the smell of rain drifted through the air. They rode back slowly, their coats damp, their voices quiet. Elias noticed how natural her presence beside him had become, the rhythm of two riders moving in the same direction without needing to speak. That evening, after supper, Clara stood by the small mirror above the washstand, brushing out her hair. The lamplight made it shimmer like wheat under sunlight. Elias sat at the table behind her, repairing a boot with slow, careful stitches. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked suddenly. She turned, surprised by the question. "To what?" He shrugged. "Family, maybe. A fresh start." Clara set the brush down. "My family's graves are east. Everything else there died long before Jacob ever left me." She paused, then added, "Besides, there's no fresh start waiting for me anywhere else. Just another kind of lonely." Elias nodded slowly. "Then maybe this place can be enough." Her eyes softened. "You think it could?" He hesitated, then met her gaze. "I think it already is." Before either could say more, Ranger barked once outside, sharp, alert. Elias stood fast, hand going to his rifle. He stepped out onto the porch, eyes narrowing toward the fence line. In the faint moonlight, a figure was walking up the path. Clara joined him, clutching her shawl. "Is it?" "No," Elias said after a beat. "Not him." The man who approached was older, wearing a deputy's badge. He raised a hand in greeting. "Evening, Grady," he called. "Didn't mean to startle you." Elias lowered the rifle, but didn't relax completely. "What brings you this far, Sheriff?" "Came with news," the man said, climbing the steps. "Jacob Dunn's dead. They found him outside Las Piedras 3 days ago. Fell from his horse, broke his neck. Drunk as always." Clara's breath caught. She stood still, her eyes darting to Elias, then to the ground. "Are you sure?" The sheriff nodded. "Sure as sunrise. Thought you ought to know. Folks said he'd been talking about heading back this way before it happened. Guess he didn't make it." Elias thanked him quietly and saw him off, then turned back toward Clara. She was still standing in the doorway, her face pale but calm. "You're free now," Elias said softly. Her hands trembled slightly as she exhaled. "I don't feel free," she said. "Just done." He stepped closer. "That's what freedom feels like at first. It don't sing. It just gets quiet." She looked up at him, eyes wet but steady. "You always know the right thing to say?" He shook his head. "Only after saying the wrong ones for years." That night, she didn't sleep in the spare room. She didn't ask, and he didn't question it. When he found her standing by the window in his room, she said, "It feels strange being in here again." He moved beside her. "Not to me." For a long moment, they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the light rain blur the outline of the barn outside. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It carried every shared glance, every moment of fear, every word left unspoken since that first night she'd knocked on his door. When she turned toward him, Elias didn't move away. He reached up, hesitated, then brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I can't," she whispered. "Not tonight." He understood. Without another word, he sat beside her on the bed. The rain fell steady outside, soft and rhythmic against the roof. When her hand found his, it wasn't out of need, it was trust and something deeper that neither of them had planned for. They stayed like that until the lamp burned low and the world outside slipped into silence. By morning, the storm had passed, and sunlight broke across the hills. Clara was already in the kitchen when Elias woke, humming softly as she poured coffee. The sight filled the house with a kind of warmth he hadn't felt since before Martha's death, not replacing what was lost, but healing what remained. Elias stood in the doorway, watching her. "You planning on staying a while longer?" he asked. She turned, smiling faintly. "I thought I already was." He nodded once, and the answer seemed enough. The ghosts that had haunted that ranch for years were gone now, carried off by the wind and time. All that was left was a man and a woman, both scarred by what they'd endured but bound by what they had quietly built, a life that had grown out of silence, loss, and the simple act of choosing to stay. And as the sun rose higher over the plains, Elias Grady finally let himself believe that the past could rest, and that maybe, just maybe, peace had found its way home. The next spring arrived slowly, as if the land itself needed time to recover from what it had endured. The hills around the ranch turned from dull gray to soft green, and the stream behind the cottonwoods began to flow again after months of dryness. Life was returning, quiet but steady, and so were they. Elias stood by the corral one morning, tightening the new rail he'd built from timber hauled weeks ago. The sound of a hammer against wood carried through the still air. Behind him, Clara hung freshly washed linens across the porch rail, her movements calm and sure. It had been nearly 6 months since Jacob's death, and though neither of them spoke of him anymore, his shadow had finally lifted. The house that had once felt like a tomb now looked lived in. Curtains white from washing, floors swept, the faint smell of bread and soap drifting through open windows. Elias paused his work to look toward her. She noticed, smiled, and said, "You've been out there since sunrise." He leaned against the fence post, adjusting his hat. Old habits die slow. She walked closer, wiping her hands on her apron. "You don't have to work every inch of this land alone anymore, you know." He gave a faint, tired smile. "I know, but the land still listens better when you talk to it with your hands." Clara laughed softly, the kind of laugh he hadn't heard from her before. "You talk to the land, I'll talk to the chickens," she said, and turned back toward the house. It was a simple exchange, but something in it warmed him. For years, silence had been his shield. Now it had become a shared language, something that didn't need to be broken to feel alive. Later that day, Elias saddled the bay mare and asked Clara to ride with him to the edge of the property. The air was warm, the sky wide and clear. She hesitated only a second before climbing into the saddle. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Nowhere far," he said. "Just something I want you to see." They rode for nearly an hour through the open country until they reached the low ridge that overlooked the valley. The grass swayed in long, slow waves under the breeze. Below them lay the small fenced patch of land where Martha had been buried. Elias dismounted, removed his hat, and stood silently. Clara stayed beside him, unsure at first whether to speak. "She's here," he said quietly, eyes on the simple wooden cross. "I thought it'd get easier to stand here with time. It never did. Not until now." Clara swallowed, her voice gentle. "You don't have to explain it to me." He nodded, taking a long breath. "I used to think I was keeping this place alive for her, but I was just keeping myself trapped in it. You helped change that." Clara's throat tightened. "Elias." He turned toward her, eyes calm but clear. "She was my wife. You're not her, you're you. And I don't want to keep confusing the two." She blinked, unsure what to say. "And what do you want now?" He smiled faintly. "I want to live again. Not as who I was, as who I am. And if you'll have it, I'd like that to be here. With you." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She reached out, resting a hand over his. "I'd like that too." They stood there together for a long moment, the wind moving gently through the grass. When they rode back home, neither spoke much, but the silence was different now. Peaceful, full. That evening, Elias went into town for the first time in months. Clara stayed behind, tidying the house and wondering what he was doing there. When he returned after sunset, he carried a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" she asked, setting down the lamp. He set it on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a simple silver ring, smooth and unpolished, shaped by hand rather than store-bought shine. "Figured we've both spent enough of our lives being owned by other people's names," he said. "Thought we might make our own." Clara's lips parted, surprise and emotion catching together in her chest. "Are you asking me?" Elias nodded once, his voice low but steady. "I am." She didn't hesitate. "Then yes." He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes, soft and tired but full of life. "We'll do it simple. Just us, and a preacher from town. The wedding was small, held a week later under the same cottonwoods where Martha rested. No guests, no celebration, just sunlight, wildflowers, and two people who had earned their peace the hard way. When the preacher spoke the final words, Elias took Clara's hand, strong, calloused, honest, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't fancy, but it was true. Afterward, they rode home together. Clara leaned against him in the saddle, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. The house came into view. The old ranch that had once stood as a monument to loss now glowed with lamplight and warmth. That night, as they ate supper, the clock on the mantel ticked steady, just as it always had. But for the first time in years, it didn't sound lonely. Ranger dozed by the hearth, the smell of wood smoke drifting lazily through the air. Clara reached across the table, taking Elias's hand. "You ever think she'd want this for you?" she asked softly. Elias looked at her, eyes clear and peaceful. "I think she'd be glad the house isn't quiet anymore." When morning came, the first sunlight poured through the kitchen window, landing across Clara's wedding ring as she kneaded bread. Elias stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching her with the same quiet awe he used to have for the land itself. There was no grief now, only gratitude for what was lost, for what had been found, and for the chance to live again. He walked over, brushed a hand against her shoulder, and said, "Looks like a good day coming." Clara smiled without turning. Every day's been better than the last. Outside, the land stretched wide and open beneath a clean blue sky. The fences stood strong, the horses grazed lazily, and the sound of life filled every corner of the place. For the first time since the fever took his wife, Elias Grady no longer carried the weight of the past on his back. He had kept his promise to Martha, to live, to care for the land, to endure. But he had also done something more. He had learned to open his door again. As the morning sun rose higher over the ridge, the old ranch stood renewed. Not haunted, not broken, but whole. A place no longer built on memory, but on life itself. And for Elias and Clara, the frontier no longer felt like exile. It felt like home.